Slavery in Canada is often overshadowed by the history of the Underground Railroad and Canada's reputation as a refuge for freedom seekers. However, the reality is more complex. From the 1600s through the early 1800s, slavery was a legal and accepted institution in what is now Canada, practiced under both French and British colonial rule. Today we trace the historical arc of slavery in Canada, beginning with its roots in New France, the influence of the Cold Noir, the continuation of slavery under British rule, the acts of resistance by enslaved people, and finally, its abolition. Slavery in Canada began during the era of New France in the early 17th century. The first recorded enslaved person in the colony was a young boy from Madagascar or Guinea named Oliver Lejeune, purchased in 1629. Though New France did not develop a plantation economy like those in the Caribbean or the American South, slavery nonetheless became institutionalized. Enslaved people in New France fell into two main categories: indigenous slaves and Africans. Indigenous slaves were often captured during conflicts with other First Nations and sold or traded to French colonists. Africans were imported in smaller numbers, typically to serve as household servants for elite families. The Code Noir, issued by King Louis XIV in 1685 for the French Caribbean colonies, was not officially adopted in New France, but its principles impacted societal norms. The Code Noir regulated the life, behavior, and treatment of enslaved Africans and required that they be baptized into the Catholic faith. Though New France never had large-scale sugar plantations, the Code Noir's impact helped justify slavery and influence colonial policy and practices. While not codified to the same extent in New France, slavery became a recognized legal institution by the early 18th century. Colonial officials granted permission for the purchase and ownership of slaves, and courts enforced contracts and punishments involving enslaved people. By the time of the British conquest of New France in 1763, approximately 3,600 enslaved people had lived in the colony, about 2/3 of them indigenous and 1/3 of them of African descent. When the British took control of New France following the Treaty of Paris in 1763, slavery did not end, it adapted. The British continued to recognize the property rights of slaveholders. As loyalists fled the American Revolution and resettled in what became Upper and Lower Canada, present-day Ontario and Quebec, many brought their enslaved African and indigenous servants with them. The practice of slavery spread into Upper Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. Estimates suggest that at its peak, approximately 4,000 enslaved Africans and indigenous people lived in British North America. British legal tradition supported slavery through property laws, and enslaved people could be bought, sold, and inherited. Despite the legal structure supporting slavery, enslaved people in Canada resisted their bondage in numerous ways. Some, like Khloe Kulie, a black woman enslaved in Upper Canada, became symbols of resistance. In 1793, Kulie was violently taken across the Niagara River and sold in the United States. Her screams and resistance were witnessed by concerned citizens, prompting Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe to act. Kulie's case became a catalyst for political change. Though Simcoe faced opposition from pro-slavery legislators, he managed to pass the Act to Limit Slavery in Upper Canada in 1793. While it did not abolish slavery, it prohibited the importation of new slaves and mandated that children born to enslaved women be freed at the age of 25. It was the first anti-slavery legislation in the British Empire. Other forms of resistance included escape attempts, work slowdowns, feigned illnesses, and seeking legal freedom in court. Some enslaved people successfully sued for their freedom, arguing that slavery had no basis in common law. Communities of free black people, especially in Nova Scotia, offered limited refuge to those who escaped enslavement. The road to abolition was gradual. While Upper Canada began restricting slavery in 1793, slavery remained legal elsewhere in British North America. Public opinion in Britain and its colonies began shifting in the early 19th century, largely due to the work of abolitionists and growing religious opposition. The decisive moment came with the passage of the Slavery Abolition Act by the British Parliament in 1833, which came into effect across the British Empire. August 1st, 1834, this act legally abolished slavery throughout Canada, liberating the remaining enslaved people in the provinces. Though Canada became a beacon for freedom in the years that followed, especially through the Underground Railroad, which brought thousands of African Americans to Canadian soil, the legacy of slavery continued to shape race relations in the country. Enslaved people and their descendants often faced discrimination, economic marginalization, and social exclusion well into the 20th century. Slavery in Canada, while not on the scale of the American South or the Caribbean, was a real and brutal system that affected thousands of Africans and indigenous lives. From New France through British rule, enslaved people lived under the constant threat of violence and family separation. Their resistance and resilience laid the groundwork for early abolitionist movements in Canada and beyond. Understanding the full history of slavery in Canada is essential to confronting the legacies of racism and colonialism still present today. By acknowledging this part of Canada's past, we honor the memory and resistance of those who lived through it and recognize the long struggle for freedom and justice that continues. To all of the Africans who endured the slavery and survived the slavery in Canada, we proudly stand on your shoulders. For more information, please visit my website at www.ontheshoulders1.com. There, you can support my OTSOG book series. You can also support me on Patreon at patreon.com/OTSOG, and you can hit the super like button under this video. I love all of you, and make sure you catch the next video coming up.